Yes, Guyana to the world.
GlobeSpan is a Guyanese dialogue moving towards the realization of one nation in one Guyana. It's a platform that offers an all-inclusive discussion with the pros, the cons, the ones that is taken aside, and the ones that stand in the middle. GlobeSpan believes agreeing and disagreeing are part of the nation's building.
She is a beauty, beautiful Guyana, with wonderful people all over this country.
GlobeSpan believes every Guyanese voice is part of the nation's building. As we span the globe for voices from the diaspora and those living home, we stand on our commitment that we are all Guyanese working towards one nation in one Guyana. As the world turns on its axis bringing changes, we as Guyanese must adapt to those changes for a better Guyana for all. GlobeSpan stands on its axis with its belief that one nation, one Guyana, one destiny must include voices from all corners of Guyana.
With many flavor, 6 different people blended together. Raise your flag high in unity, we're family with one day.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another GlobeSpan debate. And tonight we're operating under some challenging circumstances. One, I'm sitting in a power cut, blackout in Guyana, as is Vincent Alexander, and Ravi has been having some problems with his audio, hence the late start, so deep apologies. But we've got tonight a really interesting topic and a stellar group of panelists who will help to dissect it for us. With us this evening, we have Ravi, who I mentioned before, the founder of ROAR and a well-known political figure across Guyana. Dr. David Hines, a WPA member and professor of African and Caribbean Studies. Dr. Beto Ramaharak, political scientist, author, historian, and general smart guy. And of course, Vincent Alexander, a commissioner at GCOM and chairman of IPADG. My name is Kojo Paris, and I'm really proud to be sitting in for Dr. Bizram, who's on another assignment. The issue of coalitions is one which has been around for a long time in Guyana. We had the original coalition, which was the PNC-UF, which took us into independence. And then in 1985, there was an attempt at a grand coalition, which would bring the two major parties together. That literally died on the operating table with Forbes Burnham. And as recent as 2020, a small group of us in the impasse which occurred during those elections attempted to put together a national convergence plan. We consulted widely, and there was a fair amount of consensus around how we needed to go forward. Some of the main aspects of it was that the minority grouping would be able to choose 5 or 8 ministers. Around 30% of the total value of tenders issued by government would go to entities identified by the minority interests, but would go through the exact same procurement processes. And all of this would be underwritten by a 12 to 18-month national consultation process, so that we could decide for ourselves as Guyanese what sort of electoral processes and governance systems we needed. As it happens, that also failed. And the question is, and the question we're looking at tonight is, so what is this about coalitions that we need to consider as we go forward? Are they necessary? Are they even useful? Beto, why don't we start with you? What's your take on this?
Well, Kojo, good evening to you and our guests and everyone out there. So let me, I think first and foremost, before I answer that question, which is the topic of tonight's discussion, let me just say, what a coalition, because I think all of us may have a different definition, but I think we can probably agree that when we talk about coalition of parties, we are looking at creating a system where groups of people who are able to gain political power can govern a country. And the thinking is that coalition, basically because it includes people from different groups, that in a sense would be more inclusive, and it can be less conflictual, because you're taking, different groups, putting them together in the same bucket, so to speak, so they can address the various issues, that they see in society. However, coalitions also are not necessarily stable because you're bringing in, different entities into a grouping. So they can be, fractious, they can survive for a while, but then they can kind of break up. Now, in terms of Guyana, I think we can point to two instances, where coalition have actually governed. That would be the first one would be in 64, right? And of course, there was some different circumstances there. And then the other one would be in 2015. Now, in 1964, that coalition was a coalition that was formed after the election, right? So you have the UF, which was a conservative, capitalist-oriented political party forming with the PNC. 2015, you have APNU plus AFC. This coalition of parties in 2015 was formed before, because we have a constitution that says you can't form coalition after, right? So thus you have coalition. Now from looking at our history, what I would argue is that, and I'm getting to your question, it's very difficult for coalition to survive historically, as we have seen. One of the things Granger spoke about in 2018, and I think Ken Dance, one of the things they keep saying is that you have to have trust, right? We didn't have that in 64. So that was a coalition of convenience, right? In fact, when the British were so gung-ho on trying to get Chetty Jagan out of office, that as soon as there was a sort of a legal wrangling, because Chetty, his party had 45%, the UF combined with the PNC had about 53%. So Chetty's argument was, well, we are the major party, so we should be able to form the government. So the British had to do some wrangling. And in fact, once they did that, they got the two sides to coalesce. And in fact, it happened so quick that Bonham's wife, Sheila Taste, didn't have time to change into her, her good-looking dress. But the point I'm making is that kind of coalition was different. The one we see in 2015, which we'll talk more about, that's the one that most of our viewers would be more familiar with. But the answer to your question, for 2025, I don't see a coalition going anywhere and defeating the PPP for a whole number of reasons that we can get into here. You are going to see coalition of convenience. You're not like grand coalition in the sense that everybody's interests are represented, right? The trust is not there. You already have, Nigel Hughes and Norton saying, well, we want to be leaders and so on. We're going to be leader of the coalition, but we can get into that later. So my answer to your question for 2025, coalition sounds good, but I don't see that happening, because I do believe, and again, this is a hunch, I have not seen any political polls or opinion polls. I believe that the PPP will be able to increase the number of seats, and they may be able to get that 50% threshold. That's my sense. Again, I'm not basing that on anything, but I'm basing it on speaking to people and being in Guyana and observing what's going on and listening to people in the taxi and so on. So I don't see a coalition, even though as defeating the current regime in 2025.
Okay, Beto, you went a little bit beyond the brief.
I'm sorry.
I was specifically interested in your notions of coalitions and if they could actually work in Guyana, not around the prospects for the 2025 elections. David, I know you've got some interesting views on coalitions generally. Do you want to give us a high-level take on your notion of the role or the relevance of coalitions in Guyanese politics?
I like that. Yes, good evening to my fellow panelists, and of course to you, Brother Kojo, welcome on board. I think coalition is always a companion to other forms of government in Guyana. If we go back to the original mass party, the PPP, that itself was a coalition. It was a coalition of force. It was a fragile coalition too, because coalitions by their very nature are fragile. So let's get it out of the way. But the 1953 formation was a coalition of forces. It included African representative, Indian representative, trade union representative, middle class representative, far left, center moderates, and so on. It still perhaps is the best representation of what a coalition could be. And that had to be because we live in a plural society. And I'm stealing a little bit from Vincent, who I'm sure is going to use that term later on. We are a plural society and we cannot get away from it. And our politics have to mirror that plurality. In many respects, we have since been swimming against the tide, but at every opportunity, when the crisis of the single party system, the winner-take-all system stares us in our face, we are automatically pushed back by a force, back to the notion of coalition. In fact, long before scholars around the world had begun to toy with the idea of the grand coalition, what we call power sharing or shared governments. My mentor, UC Guyana in 1961, raised the matter on the eve of what turned out to be a minor civil war, and if there is such a thing as a minor civil war, a civil war between the two ethnic groups. And he saw that coming, and he put forward the first, if you will, example of power sharing in Guyana by calling for what he referred to as a joint premiership, where the leaders of the two major parties, the two ethnic groups, come together and govern the country together. That was the first. In that sense, Guyana is both the political and theoretical pioneer of what we come to know as power sharing today. Both Dr. Jagan and Mr. Burnham rejected it, but at different times in their lives, they all had gone, both of them had gone back to that. Because like I said, it's not about a choice we have. It's about a force that pushes you there because of the plural nature. And not just that we're in a plural society, but we are in an acutely divided society. Guyana argued that neither Africans nor Indians wanted to be governed by each other. I don't think that has changed. That does not, right. You know. So the point I'm trying to make is coalition, and there are different forms of coalition, as Beta Ram pointed out there. You know, coalition of the willing, coalition that is driven by constitution. You know, a coalition before an elections, coalition after an election. So coalition is a broad term, but if we look at coalition within the confines or the parameters of a Guyana, we have to see it within the context of the very nature of our society.
Right. Thanks for that. Ravi, David is making the argument in plural societies, coalitions are de facto the most equitable way to govern, and in a sense, eventually the more stable way, because it includes the voices of everyone. You're a politician, you've been in the trenches. Tell us about your take on the issue of, are coalitions necessary? Are they going to be important going forward in Guyana? Ravi, you got to unmute yourself.
You're on mute.
Yeah, sorry. Good evening to everyone, panelists and the viewers and listeners out there. Yeah, the question was phrased, should coalitions be the future of Guyanese electoral politics? Ought the politics be geared towards coalitions? Now, our friend Immanuel Kant said, ought implies can. And I'd like to look at that question first, that unless we are going back to the scholastics to argue how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. Really, can we have coalitions in Guyana? And we have to go back to our history. And first and foremost, I would say that in each instance where we have tried coalitions in Guyana, they have not worked. As David alluded to the fact that the first PPP, the nationalist movement, was a coalition of sorts, carefully crafted. David forgot to mention there was even a Chinese thrown in, a local white thrown in. Everybody was in. So it fell apart. When Mr. Burnham formed the PNC after the 57 election, the PNC was from the very beginning a coalition. Mr. Burnham, merged with the UDP, the middle class party of the colored, elites of that time, John Carter and Kennedy and so on. And that basically later Mr. Burnham had to, in a sense, take care of that situation, sent most of them into exile through ambassadorships and otherwise. And through the 64 coalition, we have to not make these theoretical arguments. The 64 coalition was an imposed coalition. The British that was ruling Guyana imposed that coalition deliberately, not even furtively, overtly imposed it to accomplish their aim, which was to get rid of the PPP. So as to its failures or success, we must first understand whatever success it had to do with the fact that it was imposed, and therefore it was the epitome of a coalition of convenience just to get rid of the PNC. Similarly, when people talk about coalitions, and I noticed our friend Henry Jeffrey was there today, invariably invokes the Ireland experience. That is an imposed coalition. You have the British government that brought them together, that brings them together, that rejigs the coalition when there are problems. So you have Westminster always getting involved in that. What is the situation in Guyana? In Guyana, that's what it comes, should coalition politics be the way forward to Guyana? First of all, we have no supranational organization that's going to force us, as in those two cases. What we have are the political parties in Guyana to make a decision, and political parties will make a decision based on their interest. And what we have seen up to now is that both the PPP and the PNC, both the PPP and the PNC, while there will sometimes be talk of coalition politics, the way in which it is framed and the way in which it went forward, it never has worked out. As to now come to the question as it should, I want to end on this note that we cannot just go back to look at these historical examples, even as I did to follow up from David's introduction. But basically, one of the problems is that you cannot ossify your politics. Because when in those times, the demographics of Guyana were different, and it is in my humble estimation that we are now a nation of minorities. And for any political party to reach that 50+1 mystical number to gain the government, they will have to reach across whatever divides we have, be they class or caste or ethnicity or whatever. And in so doing, the whole dynamics are changing. And we see this happening in the last few elections, where we have had governments in and out by these parties that serve to address problems across the divide. And so I would say at this juncture, we don't really need to force an issue where both parties don't really want it, because there's another mechanism in place out of their own self-interest. If they want to get into power, they'll reach across the divide and moderate whatever these plural divisions are caused by.
Ravi, thanks a lot. And I love the fact that you can blend the academic and the practical. And effectively, you're saying, don't push it, don't force it. It will happen naturally. And Vincent, you've been in the trenches for a while. What is your take on what you've heard so far?
In some regards, I want to go back to where David and Ravi started. I think that if we were to look carefully at the political landscape, historical perspective, we see that there's always been attempts at coalition, whether they articulated it that way or not. Starting in 1950, the PPP was in fact bringing together of the ethnic groups consciously. In some regards, they reach out looking for an African Guyanese to join. And so I'd say in 1950, we started off with that coalition. There was a kind of a break between 1950 and 1964. Probably not. Probably one can even look to the PPP and the way in which the Marxist PPP, they integrated what he called the progressive petty bourgeoisie as some kind of coalition as well. I mean, the basis may have differed. That might have been the basis might have been different, but certainly that was also an attempt at coalition. The 1964 experience, we've all accepted that that has been the case as well. We have had attempts in 1977, I think it was, with the PPP and the PNC, and then the 1985 attempt. We have seen that in 1992, the PPP talked about the PPP Civic. One can say that that also was an attempt at some form of coalition. Under Hoyt, we had the PNC/R, PNC and the Reform. There were two different bodies that came together. Subsequently, the PNC became PNC Reform. So we can say that there again, there was an attempt at coalition, and we saw what has occurred in 2015 and 2020. So that historically, we've tended to move in that direction. The basis has not always been the same. One may argue that a coalition, to a large extent, has sought to follow the ethnic contours of the society, and that's what we saw in '53. In some instances, it sought to go across the ideological divide, and that's what we saw in '64. In the case of the Civic, again, one can say that that was an attempt to go across the ethnic divide. AFC, APNU, in some regards, may be seen also as going across the ethnic divide. The point is, we've always had, whether we articulated it or not, attempts at coalescing on different bases, ethnic basis, ideological basis, various bases, and one may also say opportunistic basis. So that it seems something almost natural reflection, a natural representation of how our population, our demography seeks to create a political superstructure for the governance of all. And so it is built on this whole concept of, on one hand, society being plural society, on the other hand, an attempt to have a society that is inclusive for the purpose of responding to the plural nature in the context of one body politic. Whether or not that is of the future is another question, but certainly it continues to be an intuitive approach to our politics. Coalescing continues to be intuitive, and in that regard, it's responsive to the demography, responsive to the challenge of nation building. But yes, we must confess, so far it has not been a success. And one has to probably ask the question why it has not been a success, given the background that it has been responsive to our reality as a plural society.
Mm. And Vincent, I think that's an important question we want to take up later in the program. I just want to go back to you, Beto, because you kind of straight from the brief and you gave us a prediction. And what I'm after from you is with a similar analysis to what the others have given, where the consensus or the broad view is that we're in a plural society, and be it within political parties which become organic coalitions, or as in 2015, where parties explicitly come together for winning power, some form of coalescing will be required, and we can call it a coalition or we can call it whatever. So Beto, I want to ask you once again, do you believe that coalitions in whichever form, either pre, post, or the organic coalitions are important, and will be an important part of Guyanese politics going ahead? We don't want to know your election predictions.
Well, and I thought that would be the more relevant question here tonight, but in any case, we're in an election year. But in any case, yes, I do. I think we are all moving in the direction that suggests that, yes, there are problems with coalition, right? But at the same time, it does represent, a sort of equation, a political equation, which can work well, because as Vincent says, we are a plural society, and we do have a lot of issues to deal with. However, I think we have kind of strayed away, from this whole notion of what a coalition is. In my mind, I'm thinking of coalition of political parties. We can talk about, coalition of leaders, but I don't see that in terms of where my head is, in terms of having an institution and organization that can bring votes. And I think this, to a certain extent, we're kind of perversing the whole notion of, what a coalition is. And again, when you look at Guyana, when we talk about coalition, yes, there have been many different attempts, right? But the question is coalition of who and a coalition of what, to what purpose? And I think those are questions we do have to raise, because, when APNU was formed, that was a coalition, right? You had, you had the PNC and 4 other minor political parties that had a couple of votes out there. Were those, did those parties actually make up what we call a coalition of political parties? Then you had the AFC, so we have a coalition of coalition in 2015. So that even creates a whole other notion of what a coalition is. And so I think we also have to look at that. What does that really mean? Is it about institutions? Is it about, political institutions and organizations that can really garner votes, so you can make that coalition a coalition of values that recognizes, the interests of all of those, groups that are part of that coalition. Otherwise, it's not a coalition. It's a coalition of convenience. We've seen the imposed one in '64, and I think the one in 2015 was a coalition of convenience also, because we can get into the, the problems with that coalition, but the point is, I think coalition is good, but I don't see that happening now because of the reasons, we have been discussing here tonight.
Right, and Beto, we'll definitely find a slot on GlobeSpan to address some of the questions that you raised, which are important. I think we're agreeing around the fact that coalitions in some form or the other are going to be necessary. They will be opportunistic, etc. The question is, are there lessons to be learned from the past failures? And I want to ask you, David, to cast your analytical eye over there. You told us, you took us all the way back to 1957. What have been the main failures or reasons for the failures of coalitions?
Well, failure to do what? The first question one has to ask is why do you form coalitions? And here I want to make a distinction between electoral coalitions and coalitions that are driven by something much more organic to the society. In plural societies, especially conflictual societies, coalitions can play a role of mitigating conflict in society. Okay, so half the coalitions that we have had thus far from 1953 to the present help to mitigate the inherent conflict in these sharply divided societies like Guyana. And I would say they have done very well in terms of holding our country together. There are times when the PPP and the PNC had been moving towards coalition. In 1977, when the PPP presented the National Patriotic Front with the PNC, it was to withstand the external pressures from quote-unquote imperialism at that time. In 1985, when they made another attempt, it was again against the economic pressures coming from the external forces. So, and you look at other coalitions. The WPA itself was a coalition of 4 different civil society groups, and they didn't start as a political party. So I think we ought to make a distinction between coalitions that have been formed to hold our society together against internal attacks and external attacks. And I think those coalitions have done well. Every time Guyana has slid to the edge, we have found a way to come together and keep it from going over the cliff. And so I would say they've done well. Electoral coalitions have not done as well. And the reason the major reason in my estimation that electoral coalitions have not done well is that the very nature of coalition runs against the nature of the political system we have. We have a political system that is winner take all. And then we have coalitions, which is about coming together. So what you have is the nature of the formation called coalition coming up against a formation that is anti-coalition. Right. Right? So I just want to leave it there. I want to say here that let's get into this thing clinically. I am not interested in who wins the next election when I come on a program like this. Not my business. See me on Politics 101 for that.
Yeah, I mean, David, Beto is entitled to
No, I'm not shooting at Beto. I'm just saying, in case people are wondering why I'm not going down the road of Beto.
That's fine.
It's not that I'm not interested in who will win the next election, but I don't see that as
Rafi, David makes some interesting points around the relevance of certain forms of coalitions and what sort of challenges they face. Have you got anything to say about that from your own experience of playing in the political space in Guyana?
Well, 2 things. The first one would be, there's a kind of a idealistic notion of kumbaya, that if we all could just sit together, come around, everything will be, will be fine, everything will be okay, And in fact, Mr. Burnham once answered this question about coalition to say that, well, why should the lion sit down with the lamb? As to who was the lion and who was the lamb, we won't get into that. But I think the point he was making was that from the moment you begin to talk about coalition, you're talking about entities that are in some way, shape, or form either different or they see themselves as different. And therefore, for them to come together, they will have to make compromises. They will have to jettison some of what they may have stood for. So it's a whole new mindset that you have to put on. So to come back to our situation in Guyana, we have to make this distinction. We have heard about the coalition of convenience. And presently we are hearing about that. How can we have these a coalition of the opposition parties so we can get rid of this dastardly PPP? And you get the point I'm making. So that's a coalition of convenience. That should be opposed to what is called a coalition of commitment, where you come together, as Mr. Burnham and Dr. Jagan tried to do in 85, 77 and 85. That would have been a coalition of commitment, that they were committed to certain values, in that case, socialist values, and they wanted to protect those values. So if they were to have come together, they would have been unified in their worldview. And that is the whole point about where we're going. But when you have a situation as we do presently, where we're simply trying to accede to power, then you are not making any compromises. And the last example we had of the APNU coalescing with the AFC, that was another opportunity where it was expected that there would have been some kind of compromise and where you would have stood for something, right? At least in the economic realm, while we're not socialist inclined, some people have decided to even jettison the term Marxist-Leninist. There is at least some acceptance of the economic arrangements for the country. So you'd have thought that they would have coalesced around that, committed to how you develop the country, but it was not to be. And we have to again come back to what is real, the empirical evidence. We can't just get caught up with this whole notion of kumbaya. So I am saying that we have arrived at a historic juncture where while we were a plural society, what prevented us from moving forward was that the two blocks were almost evenly matched. And because they were not evenly matched, neither wanted to compromise, as what a real coalition of commitment implies. They each felt they could govern on their own. Well, we are not in that situation anymore. This is why I'm saying, while we don't have to discard everything that our history has taught us, we have to see new beginnings. And from living every day in Guyana, from moving around, from being exposed to young people, especially I have two young children, two young professionals in Guyana who interact, they come back, we talk, I meet some of the people out there. I think because of the new demographics, where no one group has an advantage over the other, where you have to moderate your rhetoric to attract votes. In that moderation of rhetoric, in that moderation of programs to be inclusive, I think that is unleashing its own dynamic. And it is my hope that both of the two groupings that we have right now can adopt that. I see Mr. Norton, Aubrey Norton, adopting some of those premises. And I think that if both of them can go forward on that basis, be moderate, don't be in any way hard and fast, accept that your programs will have to include the other. I think we begin to see changes. I think we're beginning to see already in the youths.
Wow, and that's a very optimistic note, Ravi. And I wonder, Vincent, if you could briefly comment on Ravi's analysis of these coalitions of convenience versus those of commitment, and Ravi's upbeat view in terms of how the demographics have really pushed us to a point where coalitions may be inevitable, be they organic or be they substantive.
I think the issue that we haven't specifically mentioned, which is at the core of this issue, is purpose. For what purpose are these coalitions formed? For what purpose? And as I said earlier, there are some which are articulated and there are others which are not articulated. but undoubtedly the actors have a motive for the engagement that we call a coalition. Actors undoubtedly have a motive. And that motive has to be seen in the context of two things. One, in the context of quest for political power, quest for political power. And it also has to be seen in the context of nation building. Can political power be exercised outside of some kind of coalition if we are going to really move towards nation building, creating this nation state that we are in? Now, in that regard, coalitions could be very opportunistic and not really aimed at nation building, but aimed as gaining political power. And the question is whether a coalition which is built on the objective of gaining political power, without going beyond that, for a purpose other than gaining power, can really survive in a society that is a plural society. And it really survive, because the chances are that it will not serve the purpose of the nation and the people at large, and therefore the extent to which the politics tend to reflect the reality on the ground is the extent to which that kind of coalition would find itself in contradiction to the reality of the ground, and therefore may not stand the chance of lasting. So that when we have a coalition and we accept that people are of different persuasions, of different ethnicities and so coalescing, then the coalition must provide for a unity of opposites. Unity of opposites, things that are not homogeneous, but coming together, and there must be some basis on which that unity can survive. And my humble contention is the unity has to survive because of a commonality of purpose. If the commonality of purpose is to gain power, then that unity can well be short-lived. If the commonality of purpose is nation building, then it can survive over time. So that ultimately, if we are looking at how we can continue to evolve as a nation, coalescing becomes critical. It must be coalescing for the purpose of nation building, rather than coalescing for the purpose of the acquisition of power.
Right. And Vincent, I want to ask Beto, as the person tonight who's being, in a sense, the most provocative. Beto, do you want to comment on what you're hearing here? Because there's a general consensus around, if not the need, but the inevitability for coalitions. I don't sense that you share the same view.
Well, as I said before, I think when we talk about coalition, a question that comes up is a coalition for what and around what? And I know you don't want me to talk about, the situation, but we do have examples and we have to draw lessons, right? There's a history, there's a historical memory of what coalition means in the Guyanese context. Yes, we do have some changes that are taking place. The demographics have changed, right? The political dynamics have changed. There's tremendous changes in the economy and so on. But that history, that historical memory, we just can't ignore that. And yes, I do understand the arguments that are being made for a coalition. But again, in my mind, I'm thinking of a coalition of political parties that represents specific values and specific interests that can contribute to what we're talking about when we talk about nation building. I don't I don't see that happening yet. I don't see that here. But we don't we have a situation where we have individuals who are even willing to address that question of coalition. So then where are those values? And again, it comes back to this question, coalition for what purpose? We don't have an experience where we can say, look, well, this was a coalition of commitment. We didn't have that, right? We have coalition where trust was an issue. We have coalition, where there were no checks and balances in those examples of the coalition we have. We talk about us being a plural society. If you're forming a coalition, you have to be able to address those issues within the coalition. We don't see that happening. Certainly, I didn't see that happening in 2015. So we have to take those things into consideration. We can't ignore that because the history we had with coalition, and I do believe if you ask Guyanese and talk about coalition, you will get that negative response about what coalition means. So there has to be a level of understanding, a level of commitment among leaders, because essentially, coalition are really coalition of leaders of political institutions who see the reason for having a coalition. We talk about the split 1955-56. Yes, the Chetty Jagan and Barnum would say, well, it was strategic. But when you look at the rank and file, you go down to the grassroots, the people who actually vote, right? There was a realignment, right? So we have to take all of these things into consideration, so we don't have that historical memory where we can say that coalition can work. Even with the coalition of 1964, even though that was imposed, the point is it survived for a very short while, right? The people who were part of that coalition did not believe in a coalition of commitment. That fell apart in the first year of that coalition. Deguerre basically says, hey, Kid Nascimento, you can work out, the distribution between ministers, but I'm going to England. He left. So there was not that coalition was primarily to depose a system, depose a government. We see that again in 20. So when we talk about coalition, we have to look at where we are. And I don't think we are at that point where, as much as we will say here on the show that coalition would be a positive thing, it's a good way to go forward, right? We can build a nation together. It's hard for me to imagine that point is close by, and I don't see that.
So David, the idea of coalitions sounds good in theory, but it's a little bit of kumbaya. How can we how do you want to address the concerns that Beto has about the practicality and the relevance of it in the context of Guyana today?
I have to confess that I come from a culture that is deeply rooted in kumbaya, and I take that very seriously because that's a cultural slight. I come from a culture that is deeply rooted in kumbaya, the notion of kumbaya. All right. So having said that, let's move on. I think we are tangling ourselves up. I made a distinction between electoral coalitions and coalitions to hold the nation together. My brother Vincent clarified for me even more. He called it nation building. Coalitions for nation building are inevitable in our societies, whether Ravi, me, Vincent, you, Kojo, or Beto want it. There will always be an instinct for coalition when you have the kind of society that we have. All right. So I want to make that clear. This coalition of commitment and the failure of coalitions and so on. The party that I belong to, and the only one that I've ever belonged to, came together as a coalition. And it came together at a time when people felt we were falling apart as a society. And nobody here can look me in the face and say that experiment of the WPA in the 1970s and the 1980s helped to hold our country when Indians felt that they were being hammered by an African government, and African people felt that they were economically being strangled and we were at each other's throat. And the WPA came and it became a movement that held that country together. That ended in 1992 with elections. But nobody here can look at me and say that that coalition that broadened to include a lot of civil society organizations and the PPP and so on, it became a movement that held our country together, all right? That kind of coalition we will always have. Like I said, in these kinds of societies that we have in Guyana, we tend, the electoral imperative takes us in one direction. And then when we look over, we see the cliff, we go back to the other kind of nation building thing and pulls us back. So you have the push-pull factor as far as that is concerned. Now we come to electoral coalition, which is what Ravi and Beto seem to be more concerned about. And I understand that, all right? Ravi and I have a fundamentally different theoretical position here. Yes, we are a nation of minorities. For me, a nation of minorities should then, it becomes easier for us now to cooperate as coalitions. Ravi is saying, no, a nation of minorities should not go for cooperation, it should go for assimilation. That the African PNC must reach over, assimilate some Indians, and moderate its tone in order to do that, or the Indian PPP must moderate its tone and bring over some Africans and assimilate. My brothers and sisters who are listening to this, if the PPP gets a quarter of Africans, it does not take away the basis for conflict. In fact, it may, in my mind, it would increase the conflict in the society, because the side that goes over will be seen as traitors. And we know when people move to that base level where they see their kith and kin as traitors, what happens? I think assimilation is a more dangerous approach in our minority society. And so fundamentally, I prefer to go towards cooperation, because I think cooperation, you don't have to go over and catch anybody from the other side. You come together as you are and said, our objective is to hold this, keep this nation together, to build this nation. We now have oil, all kinds of things come with that, right? Are we going to stay together as a nation? And if you're going to stay together as a nation, you must recognize my boundaries, I recognize your boundaries, and we come together and we build our nation. Not you trying to jump over my fence and I trying to jump over your fence and call it assimilation. I think that is dangerous in an ethnic society. So I continue to believe that insofar as we have the ability as political people to move the nation, we must, for me, I prefer to move the nation towards cooperation and coalition than towards assimilation, as I read Ravi to be saying.
Hi, Mr. Paris, you're on mute.
I think Kojo back light.
No, he's
That
mute.
might be.
He's on.
Sorry,
Yes.
sorry about that. So, David, thanks a lot. That clarified a lot of issues. Ravi, you and David have had these discussions many times before, so I want to ask you to briefly summarize your take on the difference that David is pointing out between assimilation and cooperation.
Well, that's where I differ, and I don't beg to differ, I differ from David, which is that you see he's using very loaded terms, words like assimilation, which in a plural society has a specific meaning that one then has to jettison who one is to become the other. And that's the furthest thing from my thoughts. Anyone who knows me and what I practice and what I do day in, day out as an Indian, as a Guyanese Indian, would know vehemently, I have no desire, nor do I have any desire to have anybody assimilate into something other. This is where, and in fact, I want to bring this matter to a head, that at this juncture, to have a coalition to govern by parties that see themselves as owning a set of people. David used the term of you jumping my fence and you jumping. How can you talk of nation building and in the same breath accept that there ought to be fences? We can't.
Ravi, I didn't say they ought to be fences. I said they are fences.
No, they're not. You see, you're
Yes,
making
they are.
assumption. Well, you're saying so, and I'm
Our history has borne that
David,
out.
see it.
Don't
David,
rewrite the history.
let's allow Ravi to finish his point.
Yeah, coming
You can't
back
lie on me in front of
to
me.
elections that we're going to see. See, this will be a test of it all. Back in, come back to my own experience. When David talks of the WPA having, brought the country together, all together and all that. I've spoken about this before, and I once asked me, said Ravi, if Walter was had been alive, and the WPA had, gone to the elections under Walter in '92, would he have gotten those Indian votes? And I told him bluntly, no.
And I agree with you.
And the point
But
is
that was
to make
not
is
the
that
objective of the
when the
debate, to
WPA
get
had that great conglomeration of the two races together, Jagan was seen as very ineffectual. And to be very blunt about it, a lot of Indians were very, how do I put it, almost callous about it. That black man will fight black man and get power. I want to be very blunt about that, because I used to come into the country every single year and I followed that development. So to come back to it, as we are going forward, there is now an organic development where, to use the Marxist term, where the quantitative is making qualitative changes, where our demographics, because one group cannot be dominating the other automatically. So it's not a matter of asking people to assimilate. It's now political logic. And this is why I was surprised when Mr. Granger, because I had pushed for there to be a kinder, gentler PNC. If you go back to my writings in 2009, 2010, right? And, I have spoken to members of the PNC. I was a member of the Gap Roar coalition, and I encouraged that coalition into happening, that the PNC would now, in a sense, have that cover to recreate itself. And I always will say that Robert Corbyn showed great maturity in choosing an individual who was not seen as divisive. But unfortunately, I think Mr. Granger faltered, and that whole experiment failed and has really set us back. So to come to a point where I'm saying, I don't see the need for assimilation. And if we want to see these parties as ethnic parties, and inevitably so, and forever so, then we are making a great mistake. But even if it were, what we have seen in the Balkans after the Yugoslavia split, when these parties were forced, let's take Bosnia, for instance, to take the different groups to come together in governance, it has not resolved the issue of the cultural autonomy, because they are just now ossifying the divisions, because this party represents Albanians, this party represents Serbians, and therefore it will forever be so, because each party, the humans who run these parties, want also power. That will always be there, right? And as Mr. Burnham said, who says they don't want power? They're either a scoundrel or they're lying, and I happen to believe that. So what happens is that if we want to go forward and push this kind of mega block politics, then you're ossifying the same division, and we will never have nation building. It is only when each party accepts as part of their own makeup, their own DNA, so to speak, that we have to bring in everybody within the party. Then we may have two groupings that are both working on the same premise, where is that we can all be who we are, and yet we can be one nation and go forward on that basis.
Ravi, thanks a lot. That clarifies a lot of issues. Now, we're moving towards the back end of the program. And before we go into a round where I'm going to ask you to reflect on what the others have said and identify where you think we need to go with this discussion about coalitions. Vincent, Ravi and David have similar aims but polar ways of getting to it. Can you square the circle for us?
I don't subscribe to the arguments of Ravi, because we have to look at the realities of our political parties and what motivates what they do and how they operate. You may well hear the argument, African Guyanese in the PPP never really finds comfort of oneness. And similarly, an Indian Guyanese in the PNC probably never really finds the comfort of oneness, because our plurality has to do with values and culture and the way in which we see life. And unless our processes from the very inception acknowledge those differences and embrace diversity whilst trying to find commonality, then we're going to have an ongoing problem. And one of the problems we've had with coalition historically is that whilst we have seemed naturally to want to coalesce, there's hardly ever been an acceptance that this has to do with the fact that there is a plurality that needs to be to work together, because we, by virtue of where we're located, have a common interest. So that we don't have to necessarily articulate originally a common interest. It is something that's natural because we're physically located, and in terms of the way the world is organized and all of that, we have a common interest. If we're going to develop as a nation in the context of global development. But we do not seem to accept at the level of our parties the real diversity that there is, and tend to live on a pretense that that diversity does not exist. But at the same time, in our intra-party relations, I think we run into a roadblock based on the diversity and the non-acceptance articulation, and as the basis for our operations of that diversity. Societies can move towards where we need to move towards if there is a natural process of pluralization. We have conscious objections to pluralization and the maintenance of those hard lines, not understanding that we can accept culturally that there will be some hard lines, but that the commonality is greater than, in our common interests, the existence of those hard lines. So we cannot get into a system of assimilation, which in a sense is an analogy to acculturation. We have to get into a system of Um, one where diversity is acknowledged, and one where we establish the boundaries in terms of what's common, a system that facilitates diversity and therefore facilitates working towards the commonality. The problem has been that in all of these attempts at coalescing, except for the 77, which did not fructify, and the 85, which did not fructify, it's not been the basis of understanding that there must be a common program for the nation which accommodates the interests of all, and therefore does not lend to a clash of the diverse forces, but in fact lends to coming together the diverse forces, because diversity will not be destroyed, commonality will be strengthened.
Interesting. And I am faced with the unenviable task of reining this in, and we've got about 10 more minutes to go. I want to ask a small favor. If for the next round we limit ourselves to maximum 2 minutes, and let me tell you what I'm going to ask Nohar to do, because this issue clearly has the potential to produce a level of consensus that is not normally found among you guys. And so we probably need a part 2 where we talk about how and what the nature of the sort of survivable coalitions. But we've got one of our colleagues here who I know is sitting a little bit off the consensus. Beto, can you summarize what you've been, well, reflect on what you've been hearing here in the context of your own views, and just tell us a little bit about when you leave here, what are you going forward thinking in terms of the topic? Are coalitions going to be a feature of our electoral politics going forward?
All right, so a couple of sentences. Theoretically, coalitions are good. I think we have two sides of the coins here, right? One is coalition is the way for nation building, but the problem is, how do we establish coalition of commitment that goes beyond convenience? So we have that historical problem to deal with. So we're not there yet. We don't have that organic transition to get to that point, right? Because when we talk about coalition, people think of power sharing and these kinds of things, and it brings up a whole, a lot of, notions in people's minds. But I do want to throw something out here, which, since we are not there yet, we don't have that organic, movement towards an understanding, where we can establish a coalition of political parties before and after in government, I'm talking about. In the meantime, there is a way to address this, plural problem that we're dealing with in this society we call Guyana, which is that we know that if we're agreeing that coalition is the way to go, then maybe we can focus on establishing coalition within the political party that controls power, because that is really what it's all about, because coalition forms coalition to win political power so they can implement policy. So, and again, forgive me, but I have to come back to a specific example of what I'm talking about. I'm saying in the meantime, until we get to that organic stage, if, let's say, the coalition that was there before had addressed this question of coalition for what? In other words, if one part of the coalition had said, look, we want to keep this coalition going, so we need to address the issues of the people I represent as part of this coalition. I think you boys know where I'm heading with this. If, let's say, Moses Nagamutu and Ramjatan had said, look, we are part of this coalition, we brought in 15%, so allow us to bring the issues that those people are concerned about, because we bring them into this coalition. That wasn't done. So here's my second point I do want to make. Again, we're not there yet. We're organically moving to that point. So in the meantime, the focus should be on the government in power, those who hold the reins of power, to establish some kind of a mechanism, a coalition of sort within that government that can take the interests of a plural society into consideration. An example of what I'm saying, and I'm going to end here, is if you do have within a ruling government, whether it's the, APNU or PPP or whatever it is, a sort of, a unit that represents certain folks in society, the Amerindians, the Africans, for instance, and legitimately address their issues of concern. I think we will be gradually moving to that point where we are addressing the problems of a plural society, and secondly, with those kinds of policies that come out, where we address the issues of the coalition concerns of different people, it means at some point in the future, we can probably build that grand coalition that we're talking about. I know this sounds complicated, but the point is, I think this is where we are.
And Beto, it doesn't sound complicated. It sounds like a lot of work, but not complicated. And I want to say before I go to you, David, that we've gotten power back. GPL is being generous to us, and you can see my fancy new shirt I bought for tonight's for tonight's show. David, I think there's aspects of what Beto just said which you would find some resonance with, aren't there?
Yes. I differ with Beto in that a government that represents a segment of the party is given the burden of deciding for other segments. I don't think Africans want an Indian-led government to determine the parameters of nation building for them. They want to be at the table with their Indian representatives of their Indian brethren and Amerindian brethren, and we do it together because the government is a half government. It represents half of the society, and it can't make decisions in a plural society for everybody. And so therefore cooperation that will lead to coalition becomes the issue. Look, the PPP is a coalition of forces. It's a coalition of Hindus, Muslims, and Indian Christians. And they have found a way to collate in that party for 50 years. There have been ruptures sometimes, there have been fallouts, quarrels, and so on, but they are a coalition that has held together from 1955 to the present. The PNC itself is a coalition, as Ravi so eloquently said, that in 57, it was the middle class, John Carter, the urban working class, Fox Burnham, the rural working class, AUC Guyana, right? And that coalition has by and large remained there in the PNC. There have been defections, fallouts, and so on, but they have maintained themselves as a coalition, right? The Catholic Church, Amerindians and Portuguese, for a moment, they had that coalition around the United Force. And I think in theory, that is still there. Every now and again, Mr. Hardy came, he tried to pull it back together. It was there for a minute. Mr. Schuman came the other day. He has gone out to fly planes. But those coalitions have held intact. And I want to congratulate ourselves. I want to congratulate those political parties for holding those coalitions together. Our challenge now is how to bring those coalitions to the table and to move to a higher level of coalitions. There have been challenges, and the biggest challenge has been power. Power has a way of making even the most sensible man look stupid, right? And do stupidness. Because we have not, and here is where I am with Beto, we have not worked out the mechanisms in order to balance between the imperative of power and the imperative of coalitions, right? I think in the next step of our discourse and the next step of our national agenda is how to do that. How do we bring those successful coalitions, a la PNC, beneath the politics of the PNC and the PPP and the United Front, beneath that, that politics at the top. There really is a coalition of our people at the bottom, all right? And so therefore the challenge for me is how to move those successful coalitions and to bring them together, find mechanisms to bring them together as a national coalition. And if that is Kumbaya, I plead guilty. As I say, I come from a culture of Kumbaya, and it has helped for 400 years to make us survive the plantation and shove down the gate. Kumbaya.
Ravi, that was a pretty uplifting speech performance there by David. Do you want to follow that?
Yeah, that sounds like a campaign speech there.
No,
It's very close.
Don't you the one for my campaign speech tomorrow night.
The word
That's it.
performance. So we all know it's a performance. That's all right. All right. Kojo knows it. That's fellow Buxtonians. They know how they could carry on. You know what David is doing here. No, but very seriously, and it is a serious question. I think Beto outlined the concept of what we need to do going forward, but concepts need to be given names. So as Althusser says, it then hails what we're talking about into existence. I want to give what he's proposed a name. That each of the two political parties, they're not going to disappear overnight. So what I had proposed over 20 odd years ago to Mr. Hoyt, I've spoken about this. He and I spent 3 nights going over this just before he passed. And it was the notion I told him at that juncture, because the PPP, of course, never spoke to me. With Mr. Hoyt, the notion of a caucus, that within the PNC, that there should be an Indian caucus, where the Indians, it comes up probably out of my American experience, having, after high school, done 20 years in America and gone back to Guyana, that you have like a black caucus we have there, where the black Americans would meet outside of the rest of the party, talk about their challenges, their opportunities, and what have you, come back to the party and present that. So it then have the authenticity of representation that both David and Vincent demands and ought to be demanded. You can't be just having tokens. And so I think I come back to that. Later, when one of the PPP leaders did speak to me, I made the same proposal of having a black caucus within the PPP that can speak authentically about black problems and bring it to the party. So there again, you can see whether they're being mama guide and treated tokenistically or not. So I come back to it with Mr. Hoyt. The person to talk to me was Derek Bernard. He was, and it came back to me that radicals, I don't know if Vincent was one of the radicals, torpedoed the plan at that time, around 2001 there, Vincent. But no, but again, come back to it seriously. These are things that we have talked about, and I've spoken to several African members of the PPP, senior ones, about this, and there's an agreement, but it is not getting to the top. So I think that is where we need to push at this stage. And I really want to talk to my friend David, and I call him my friend David. We may differ, our friends differ, that we differ in terms of our assessment. But what we cannot do, I think right now we're doing a disservice towards this gradual evolution in coming to a nation building by calling people who stand up for their own slave catchers. And we can't use language like that. In fact, Robert Corbyn and I once had a discussion, and again I brought that up. And I must say that Robert has never been given enough credit for what he stood for what he stood for. And I, sat next to him at the funeral of Sash Shaw, and he made a very enigmatic exclamation when something was said. He said, if this was the old Robert Corbyn, this would have never happened. What is that old Robert Corbyn? He had always talked about, very frankly to me, that you cannot have, going back to coalition, that you really can't have a real coalition in Guyana without the PPP. Robert Corbyn told me that ages ago. And I think that's why, he could have stepped aside for Mr. Granger. Now, it may seem I'm wandering, but I want to say this, that we got to be careful with our language, right? Robert, again, I've said this on public television already, once criticized an Indian member of the PNC. And he told me, he said, when the man go on a stage, Ravi, the man more Rasta than me, you know. The point is that the other within the two major parties should be, A, should be allowed to have a caucus, and B, out of that should be allowed to represent that group from which they come. And I think gradually we then will have a movement towards a common ground where we speak, and then we can speak about a coalition of commitment, because by then the trust would have been engendered where both the two major groupings would see, you know what, we're talking the same language. We're talking the same language.
Ravi, thank you. And Vincent, I'd like you to take us home on this one and spend the last 2 minutes reflecting on where the conversation has gone.
Let me pick up where Ravi left off, because in fact, and I've said this publicly before, but it seems to be something not acknowledged inside or outside, that in the PNC, I don't know what I was saying to Ravi. In the PNC, I raised the question of what I call then ethnic politics, and contended that the Indo-Guyanese in the PNC should come to the table clearly articulating what were the interests of the people of Indian descent. African Guyanese coming to the table clearly articulating the interests of the people of Indian, African descent, and that in the context of nation building, we should be able to address the interests, the concerns of the different groups at a level where the addressing of those concerns does not interfere with, does not cross paths, but that we should also identify simultaneously what are the common interests that we can then coalesce around, even as we coalesce around the idea of unity in diversity. That has to be done based, firstly, on the acceptance that we are diverse. It has to be done based on the acceptance that we exist in one boat, and that if we embrace and respect diversity in that one boat, then we've got to give space to diversity, even as we find the glue in that boat that can move us forward collectively. So we've got to derive a system that seeks to address three things. There's diverse interests, and in three things I'm saying in a sense, probably more than three, but the diverse interests. Diverse interests, without a clash between those interests and the common interests that really what should bring us together, because it's that common interest that will drive the process of nation building. One of the common interests being respect for and giving space to diversity. I don't think our political parties have matured and gotten to that point, and that work to be done really is to bring them around to, first of all, accepting unequivocal diversity, accepting that we have to work together if we are going to achieve anything of meaning for the nation, and therefore then work for the structures that will allow us to move in that direction. Our challenge, to a very large extent, is a political culture. A good starting point for that challenge would be simply an acceptance. What is not about coalescing, but simply an acceptance of the principles of good governance, inclusion being a critical one, transparency being another critical one. By transparency, I don't mean seeing through. I mean applying the same principles across the board in the resolution of problems. If we accept good governance as the basis for decision making, then I think we'd be well on our way to coalescing, because good governance includes that inclusion around which the concept of coalescing could in fact be explored.
Vincent, thank you. Ravi, David, Beto, and Vincent. I want to thank you for this evening. Listening and participating in this has been certainly a journey for me. I've certainly learned a lot, and I want to suggest that oftentimes we assume that we're further apart than we are, and certainly what tonight convinces me is that provided we can focus on issues around commitment rather than convenience, and focus on nation building rather than simply grabbing power, and looking at practical rather than idealistic solutions. Because if we recognize that we have to be unified in our diversity, that certainly forms the basis for us pulling together as a nation. You know, Guyana is at an amazing point. For the first time in all of our lives, we have the resources to do all the things each of us would have dreamt about. And whether or not it's an explicit coalition which formed between the PNC or the PPP, or the PNC or the PPP becomes a coalition of national proportions, or WPA transforms itself into an entity which binds the two together. Somewhere or the other, we have to find a way forward which allows us to make best use of this amazing patrimony that we have. And I want to thank you guys again for bringing together all of these ideas. And I'm going to ask Noher if we can have a follow-up where we move from asking the question, which we asked this evening around whether or not coalitions will be part, to one where we start to focus on the practical issues. How do we make them possible in the context of the Guyana we want to build? I want to thank you guys again. And Devin, thanks for ushering us through the challenges of GPL and giving me a chance to show off my fancy new shirt. And gentlemen, I look forward to seeing you soon. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Good evening.
Thank you.
And I want to say thanks to the